I've often thought that we could really do with conscious raising sessions involving both sexes. We don't actually have them very much that I know of in the movement, partly I think because the women are concerned to discover their own pathology without complicating it with information from the other side. But I think insofar as sexual politics is a real matter, and there could be courses in sexual politics in our universities, then it might be just as well to try doing it this way. Now, the conscious raising session that I had a little go at doing at UCLA was on rape, which seemed like a nice, sensational thing to have it about. And what I was trying to do was to institute a dialogue between the raper and the raped. I was trying to ask the men to examine themselves with regard to how they conceive of rape, what kind of an activity it is, whether they consider themselves capable of it, whether they think it's an erotic experience, whether they think of their penis ever as the avenger, like Septimus O'Shaughnessy, or the retaliator, like Norman Mailer. Whether they have ever heard that kind of jockocratic talk about, you know, punishing the old lady and really giving it to her and putting a few shots through her and etc., etc. And on the other hand, of the women, whether they still entertained or ever entertained the masochistic fantasy of being raped, whether they are aware of rape as a pattern hidden in our slush literature, in the cruelty of the hero's mouth, or the steeliness of his eyes, the hidden punishing father who is at the center of the whole romantic shibboleth for women. There is, of course, another dimension to a discussion of this kind, which is, you know, how many people in this room have been raped without redress, which is the usual situation for people who are raped, and how many men in the room are conscious of having punished a woman through sexual misuse or through fucking her with clenched teeth, as it were. Now, of course, it's difficult to start any kind of conversation on this level because it's confessional. So we can always pretend, at any rate, that we are talking about the fantasy of rape as it is institutionalized in our culture. And it seems to me, no doubt, that it is institutionalized in our culture, in the imagery of sexuality. If you think of the way that sex is even presented in movies, it's usually, you know, the good old missionary position. I sometimes wonder if, you know, filmmakers have ever heard of any alternative. The porno filmmakers are very good at, you know, one man, two girls, girl on top and all that. That's largely because of the camera angles, I'm told. So I suppose I could start off first by asking any of the men if they are aware of rape as a fashionable activity in any group of their knowledge, like locker room groups or anything of that sort.
Actual physical rape?
No, well, fantasy rape will do.
Well,
Would you like to tell us what a mental rape is? Do you want to take the microphone?
it's a certain approach that I think it's very, very common among males. I mean, particularly males who tend to have a good deal of fear of women.
Anyone else for that matter, ever felt sort of strongly physically attracted to a woman you despised?
Oh, sure, you know.
Well, I want you to tell me why, oh, sure. You know, why should it be so easy to conceive of what is an erotic activity with someone you despise?
Why? I don't know why it's so easy, but You know, there probably you have a certain amount of, you know, if you want to get psychoanalytic about it, certain amount of ideas of sex as punishment. You know, domination, control type thing.
How general do other people think this is? Are there any men who would wish to take issue with this statement that, you know, sex as punishment is prevalent in masculine sexual fantasy?
I take issue with that. My own personal theory about why somebody would want to rape someone is because of the fantastic frustration of the hassle on every, like the millions of people are looking forward to good old Friday, Saturday night hassles about let's fuck, well, I want to get to know you. You know, and I think that's basically where the sexual drive and frustration comes from, is that a girl doesn't have to worry about being raped. She can go out here and just fuck anybody. But a guy gets all this frustration. That's my theory.
Well, hang on a minute. Well, it seems to me very obvious that there is a sexual double standard working, which means that we assume that all guys want to get laid. We assume that not very many girls want to get laid, and that if they do, they want to get laid with very specific conditions applying. What Freud called, you know, the aesthetic requirements that protect a woman from the disastrous consequences of her own masochistic desires to be of service to the race. Now, I don't dig that at all, because I think it's probably true to say that many women regard their own sexuality as a commodity which will only be supplied at the highest rate, instead of regarding their sexuality as a way in which they simply express themselves. But on the other hand, I think it's also true that men have an attitude towards their sexuality which is desolating, because they really do think that they could fuck anything under certain circumstances. So that you have this kind of impossibility of truce at that level. Now, one of the things that's really worrying, I mean, you probably know that for a woman in our society, redress against rape is very difficult to get, because it's a capital crime. That means that a man pays the highest penalty. In countries where there is a death sentence, a man can be put to death for rape. In this country, rape gets about as high a sentence, some of the legal eagles might correct me, but I think it's about as high a sentence as manslaughter or murder in the second degree. At least it can do. Now, the irony is that rape is most often proved against the poor, those people unable to defend themselves. And 90% of the people at present in jail on rape charges are black men. And this means that the white woman's cry of rapo is being used as a political weapon against the black man. Now, it is understandable that any man with any power in the community who finds himself on a rape charge will move heaven and earth. He will destroy the woman who brings the charge against him rather than be forced to admit guilt. It's inconceivable to plead guilty. It's like pleading guilty on a murder charge. You just don't do it. So that you will not find any middle-class man with any kind of status in jail on a rape charge. What happens to the girl who brings a charge against a man like this is that she is questioned first in the most invidious way. She is charged with enticement. She is asked if she had an orgasm. And generally what happens is that the burden of blame is shifted to her. Now, as long as rape is a capital charge, this kind of activity on the part of the rapist is only too understandable. And yet, one thing that we are discovering more and more is that rape is an activity which makes sense, at least on a fantasy level, to nearly all the men in the community. If you can imagine fucking a woman you despise, you do have a concept of your own sexuality which is separated from your idea of esteem or tenderness or anything else. So it's pretty weird that this happens to be the situation. And what happens, of course, is that most rape goes without redress. Now the other, sorry. Well, the thing is, perhaps you're right. I mean, it seems to... Well, it wasn't really a question. She was saying that, that rape is just another way for a man to kill a woman. A woman can only kill a man. A man can both rape or kill and kill a woman. And the thing is that we have instances of that every day. There are crimes of sexual violence enacted on women. Very few crimes of this nature are ever enacted on the bodies of men, and then mostly by other men.
I just can't agree with your perspective totally, because you haven't asked the question, why do these men...
No, it's all right. He said he doesn't agree with my perspective because I haven't asked the question of why do men feel this hostility.
Maybe I can explain my terms. Obviously, it's a hostility against mother image, you know, against, and I think this, you know, if somebody wants to go out and get the mother who has done all these hideous things to the man, I think this is kind of a pathology.
Some people who don't want to hear what he has to say, but I do want to hear what he has to say because I think that's the problem. Now you see, I asked you to level. He leveled as well as he could. We may think that his fantasy of his mother's crimes against him or of women's crimes against him is unjustified. But to suppose that that cunt hatred does not exist in our society is to delude ourselves. This is what we're fighting against. Now we know that hatred is part of the pathology of oppression. We feel it too. It is useless at this point to simply hold his hatred against him without seeking to understand it and to understand its etiology, where it comes from. Look, the whole point about it is that we know that in our society motherhood is perverted because the mother is given sole responsibility for the child and the socialization of the child. We know that the first relationship between mother and child is one of mutual exploitation with incredible bitterness built into it because both partners are being deprived of a relationship with the world on a wider basis. We know the resentment that mothers feel, and we ought to be able to empathize the resentment that children feel against this whole cockeyed situation where a lonely woman in an empty house tries to relate to a person 2 feet high 24 hours a day. Now it seems to me clear that the crimes that we commit against each other are not of our choosing. That's what brutalization means. And that's what female oppression is. And that's why it makes nonsense to say that women are not oppressed and have simply borrowed a cause from the blacks, which is the view, I'm told, of Frantz Fanon. Now, the problem seems to me that our sexual relationships have been poisoned at the root in any one of a number of ways. I suspect that the most important way is the way in which capitalism makes whores of us all, because it places a price on everything. Our sex is a commodity, and what the crime of rape really represents is theft. And it is as theft that it figures in the legislation, because rape is a crime enacted actually against our fathers or our husbands. And it's interesting to notice that female under the Act only describes any woman except the defendant's wife. And this makes perfectly clear that marriage is legalized rape. Marriage is giving the use of your conjugal whole to somebody else by rule of law. And as such, we can see that rape is universal. As long as sex is only ours to dispose of as a commodity, and is a man's to use, especially in return for success and power within the community, which is the whole meaning behind Playboy, because Playboy really expounds the ethos of sex as a reward for success, then we have to realize that all those people who are oppressed by the system will also express hatred of the system's principal emblem of success, which is the woman, the young, attractive woman, who is reviled on the streets by the poor and the lonely. And as long as we say to each other that we will punish the poor, drunken, alienated creature who says, I could fuck you right up your ass on the street. As long as we think that beating up on him is a revolutionary activity, we're really being made dummies of by the whole system. Now, part of it is also the fantasy of rape that women also have. And I'm not very sure how to deal with that. You all know the Lenny Bruce story about his aunt who seemed to have some kind of understanding with the exhibitionists because every time she walked in the park she saw 8 and nobody else saw any. And he argued that this, was her real sexual experience. She complained about it all the time, but that was tantamount to boasting as far as she was concerned. And I think it's a feasible situation to imagine that a man who is desperately fighting against the brutalization of his own instincts of tenderness could find a woman who is displeased with his gentleness and asked to be violated and mistreated, which is another problem. And if we can't see that they're complementary problems, then we don't get very far at all. Now, with regard to the legal problem of rape, I wonder what kind of a crime you think rape is. What do you think happens to a woman when she's raped? You see, it's not the same as assault. Many rapes are conducted without physical violence. They're conducted by threat or by use of authority, by blackmail. And then there is also the additional blackmail of the easiness of proving enticement against any woman. I suppose you've all heard of the famous courtroom proof, where the lawyer put a hole in a piece of paper and asked someone to try and put a pencil through it and kept moving the paper. And because the pencil didn't go through the hole, he had proved the impossibility of rape without consent. Now, I can tell you that rape is possible without consent because I was beaten and raped when I was 19 years old. And I was beaten until I was unconscious, virtually, and raped eventually. And then when it was all over, I fell out of the car. I couldn't walk, and the boy said to me, "What's the matter with you?" And I realized that at least some aspect of his behavior was psychopathic. But I think we've already realized, just from the little rap we've already had, that normal sexuality in our society is psychopathic. That normal behavior is psychopathic in a psychopathic society. Sorry. Well, now that's a strange thing. How do I deal with the fact that a man has to get an erection and a woman doesn't? Now, what I'd have to say to that is, what does he have to get an erection for? Now, he has to get an erection for penetration. Penetration is not the only way of making love. The whole thing is that male sexuality has been presented as dependent upon this condition. The erection seems to be vitally important. Even comparatively sophisticated people think that you can't make love without an erection. The man must have an erection. Now, that simply isn't true. We're much more polymorphous than that. And the erection matters a great deal more to the man than it does to the woman, which we already know. Because a woman's gratification can be brought about more easily by 50 different ways than it can by simple penetration. Now, the men have anything to say about that. You see, Mailer goes on a good deal in The Prisoner of Sex about that delicate junction of ego and courage, which is an erection. And he also points out that as he grows older and his bottom grows fatter and he has more and more children and more ex-wives, he finds it harder and harder to get together, this delicate junction of ego and courage. And the thing is, of course, that Mailer would regard any sexual intercourse that did not involve the triumphant display of himself in his pride as a bore and not worth proceeding. He calls it, the drear wastes of heterosex. Now, I'm just wondering how many men really consider that a rock-hard erection is necessary to proceed in matters of tenderness. So, does anybody want to give a show of hands on that question? How many women consider that to be the case? Absolutely not. As long as you don't regard the focus of all attention as being that particular object in question. You see, it seems to me that the brutalization of the sexes takes two forms. One is the woman's idea that she has no sex. She has only a receptive faculty. And that combines with a sort of absence of genital response for many women and a great deal of sensuous response to tenderness, which is ironic because that's what she usually doesn't get. On the other hand, the male has come to think that his sexuality, and indeed his ego, because Mailer once said that the only thing he needed to keep on being a writer was that he still have his balls, which is a crazy idea, but there you are. But men seem to think that their personality, indeed their ego, resides in this little tag of flesh which has the habit of not performing when requested and performing when not requested. Now, I think you can see that there really is a kind of absence of sexual dialogue here, that we're speaking different languages. And this doesn't mean that those different languages are somehow embedded in our psyches. It doesn't mean that men and women are created as a separate race. What it really means is that we are alienated from each other by the kind of training, by the kind of conditioning that we have. The little girl is born with the same kind of infant narcissistic love that a little boy has. She also goes through a highly genital phase before reaching puberty. The argument is that this is a masculine phase, that this sexuality is not hers. It's borrowed or something. It's called masculine, and it is typically clitoral, according to Freud. So that when she becomes mature, she ceases to be principally erotic in the area of the clitoris, and in fact becomes passive and receptive, and experiences that strangely unknown phenomenon of vaginal orgasm. Now, can we just yell and I'll say it again?
One of the points, men don't initially.
Okay, well that's fair enough. What he was saying is that men are just as conditioned into believing that their erection is essential. Now, I don't know when that happens. I guess it happens, I mean, one can see it happening in literature because of the way they describe a man, experiencing desire for a woman. I mean, they say things like, that he felt a stirring in his testicles and things like that. I mean, it seems to me that the assumed animal nature of sexual instincts is one of the biggest misleading things about it. We are told from the outset that our sexuality is a sort of evacuatory exercise. Men are especially told this. And that we are, insofar as we are sexual, we are somehow bestial. Now, this is not just wrong. I mean, it's the opposite of the fact. We are more sexual than animals because we are intelligent, because we can follow a pleasure principle, because we have memory, will, and understanding to desire again that which proved pleasant. Now, it seems to me that one of the ways in which women suffer in this whole rapo situation is that if sex is falsely regarded as a sort of excretory activity, and it is regarded as improper for young people to experiment sexually, all of us come to sexual realization by masturbation. So that we are already, before we reach adulthood, dependent on our fantasies, which are very much culled from the pulp literature of sexuality, all the books we are told not to read, or we are allowed eventually to read, especially when they turn up on university syllabuses. Now, Portnoy's complaint is spoken of, as a book about a compulsive masturbator, a real freak. So if someone calls you a Portnoy, it means something very specific about your sexual behavior. Now, in fact, Portnoy is a story about a boy who comes to sex in a fairly normal way, who becomes fixated on masturbating, perhaps to an abnormal extent, but to an extent which is conceivable for anyone. He then discovers, when he finally does have a sanction to make love as a successful person, as an adult and so on, that he is still masturbating. And that's what the story is all about. And his compulsive Don Juanism and so forth are all aspects of this same problem, that his sexuality has become an autoerotic activity. Now, I think this is true for both sexes, and this is one reason why they can't get off on each other. They can only relate to organs or vibrators or stimulus of a particularly limited and localized kind. And this is why, for example, in my book I take issue with Masters and Johnson, because they're really putting out yet another push-button idea of sex. They still find no way to integrate sexual response with the total intellectual response and spiritual response to another person. And this is not just women's problem, it's everybody's problem. Now, I don't know quite what can be done about it, except that we are all involved to one extent or another with some sort of a sexual revolution. What the permissive society allows us is marketed sexual fantasy. And this has misled a great many people, because they imagine that the permissive society really encourages erotic behavior between people. It doesn't. It encourages everything else but that. It just opens the floodgates for commercialized pornographic sex, for sex as super commodity. And in fact, the existence of this kind of sexual commodity on the market means that we become ever more alienated from our own processes of delight, both giving and receiving. I mean, anybody who's ever seen blue films knows that they don't turn you on. The whole function of a blue film is to turn you off. The whole function of all voyeurist activities is to turn you off, is to provide you with a fantasy substitute. But it may very well be that the outcome of this constant titillation and utter frustration means that the walking stereotype in the street becomes ever more tantalizing. In fact, many rapists, not that we can make any sensible studies because we've only got a tiny proportion of actual rapists to study, those who are in jail, and many of whom are not even guilty. We've only got this tiny proportion to study, but even so, there seems to be a high incidence of sexual inadequacy, as defined by the pop psychologists. There also seems to be a high incidence of morbid disgust with the processes of menstruation, for example. And this is another case of the way in which women pay very heavy dues for the masculine fantasy of the goddess who is unsoiled, who doesn't fart or shit or bleed or smell or anything like that.